Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
Diane Black, a new member from the great state of Tennessee. Diane.
I thank the gentleman from California for yielding time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the great legacy of our 40th President, Ronald Wilson Reagan. As I watched some of the coverage of the President's centennial, I found myself filled with the same hope and idealism that he inspired in me over 20 years ago. During the 8 years he was in the White House, President Reagan faced great challenges, but was always optimistic that the greatness of our country and its people would bring us to a brighter day. A truly one-of-a-kind leader, President Reagan inspired freedom throughout the world and kept the American dream alive and the burning brightly for all of us. He reminded us that democracy is a precious gift, but one that is dependent on the dedication of all Americans. He believed strongly in American exceptionalism and reminded us that as citizens of such a great nation, we had a responsibility to be a beacon of hope to all of those around the world who do not enjoy the same freedoms. All of these years later, his ideals still stand true for all of us, and his message is just as urgent today as it was in the past, perhaps even more so. President Reagan is a personal hero of mine, and I want to work with my colleagues to keep his ideals of a smaller government, common sense government alive here in Washington. President Reagan believed that the people of this country are the best hope for the future, not the government or its bureaucrats. He believed that the ideals of self-government that this nation was founded on was one of the greatest ideas of history, and that by giving government back to the people, our nation would become stronger and more prosperous. Like Reagan, I too am optimistic. I believe that our best days are still ahead of us, and that a smaller government that answers to the people will let America thrive again. As we face the challenges ahead of us today, let us remember President Reagan, and with hard work, we can get this country back on track to a brighter morning. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Diane. My good friend and freshman member from the great state of Florida, Dennis Ross. And also, I might add, a fellow member on our Committee on Judiciary.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, today I rise to pay a tribute to President Reagan on his centennial celebration. As our country's 40th president, no leader in modern history has had a more lasting and greater impact in shaping America's policy on economics, national defense, and social issues. Throughout his time as a public servant, President Reagan championed the core values of lower taxes and less burdensome government that stimulated the economy and brought this country out of a long recession. Reagan's firm belief in a strong national defense inspired future democracies all over Europe and led to the defeat of the evil empire, which ended the Cold War and brought peace with Russia. He became a role model for all Americans with his sense of humor, his sense of compassion, untiring belief in unlimited freedom and respect for the unborn. President Reagan was a leader of extraordinary character, courage, and vision. He changed our great nation and never tired of firmly believing that America's best days were ahead. Happy birthday, Mr. President. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Larry Bashan, new member from Indiana. Indiana is well represented here this afternoon for President Reagan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me this time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in celebration of our nation's 40th president. Today we honor Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. This is the People's House, and Ronald Reagan was the people's president. President Reagan championed the individual by lowering the tax burden on America's citizens and promoting free markets, actions that resonated with me as a young college student. As a 19-year-old in 1981, it was President Reagan's optimism about our future and clear conservative message that guided me to become a Republican. What stood out the most to me about President Ronald Reagan was his conviction and steadfast leadership in pulling us out of the Cold War. I am honored to be able to stand here today on the House floor in celebration of a great leader, President Ronald Reagan. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Kevin Brady from Texas, longtime friend and one of our best baseball players on the congressional baseball team. Kevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your leadership as well. Mr. Speaker,
Next.
before I refuse to take your questions, I have an opening statement. That was one of the many quips we remember from the great communicator Ronald Reagan. As we mark the 100th anniversary of his birth this week on Capitol Hill, we reflect on President Reagan's many accomplishments, his leadership in tough economic times, and his ability to bring us together with his good humor. During his presidency, Ronald Reagan worked across the aisle to grow our economy by cutting tax rates and getting Washington off the back of our job creators. He believed, as he said, entrepreneurs and their small enterprises are responsible for almost all the economic growth in the United States. And he said concentrated power has always been the enemy of liberty. Those two statements of President Reagan's were never more true than today, as we have a much greater and bigger Washington bureaucracy than we could have ever imagined or could ever afford. President Reagan believed that we grow our economy by getting Washington out of the way, not by spending more tax dollars borrowed from our children and grandchildren. President Reagan knew that fiscal responsibility was key to our freedom, and he said, if we lose freedom here, there is no place to escape to. The American economy is at a crossroads, and the good news is we've been here before, and we know the way to a stronger future thanks to Ronald Reagan. I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, we have so many folks that want to speak. I need to watch my time pretty close up there, so how are we doing?
The gentleman has 10 minutes remaining.
Very good. Tim Walberg, making his second tour as a member from the great state of Minnesota. Welcome back, Tim.
Thank you, my friend, colleague from California. We're close, but from Michigan. Delighted to be here. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to remember a great man and a great president, Ronald Reagan. Although President Reagan's 100th birthday would have been celebrated this week, I am reminded how clear and timeless his principles of limited government and individual freedom remain. Many of his ideas ring as true today as they did when I first heard him speak so many years ago. Beginning in 1984, I had the pleasure of meeting President Reagan several times as a member of the Michigan legislature. The first time I met him was when I had the honor of welcoming him to Michigan on behalf of the House of Representatives and the Republican caucus. Though I forgot most of my planned speech in greeting him, he treated me as a colleague and expressed a genuine interest in our agenda for the state. His warmth and disarming kindness is what I will always remember about him personally. I always left believing, after subsequent meetings, believing more strongly in America's exceptionalism, and knowing that his common sense principles would always succeed here and abroad when attached to character, courage, and grace. I'm certain that his timeless principles, when followed, will endure for many, many years to come. May God bless the history and memory of Ronald Reagan and the country he loved. And I yield back.
Scott Desjardins from great state of Tennessee, new member. If you guys, everyone will try to help me a little bit here. I have 7 speakers in about 6 minutes, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues have done an excellent job today in eloquently paying tribute to Ronald Reagan's life and the many accomplishments he achieved throughout his presidency. I'd like to take a moment, though, to recognize one of the most instrumental figures in shaping the Reagan legacy, Nancy Reagan. In the immutable words of John Donne, no man is an island entire of itself. And with all the accolades we bestow on President Reagan, we must remember that Nancy was a key part of the Reagan team. She was an uncommon confidant and was always there to provide the president with unconditional support, which no doubt served as a source of his strength. I believe President Reagan would find any tribute to him inadequate without also recognizing the person he described as the companion without whom I'm never quite complete or happy. So thank you, Mrs. Reagan, for the role that you played in guiding our country through difficult times and ensuring that America forever remains a shining city upon a hill. I yield back my time.
Bobby Schilling from President Reagan's home state. Illinois is very well represented today. Bobby?
Today we remember our nation's 40th president, President Ronald Wilson Reagan. He would have been 100 this year. President Reagan hails from my home state of Illinois, and you know, he spent much of his childhood growing up in the Dixon area, and also worked with WOC Radio in Davenport, Iowa, and our area, we believe, had a little bit to do with forming the great communicator. Ronald Reagan was famous for saying, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." Reagan stared down the Soviet Union and demanded that they tear down the wall. He nominated the first female Supreme Court justice in Judge Sandra Day O'Connor. President Reagan is one of my heroes because he showed what can be accomplished when the best interest of the company are placed ahead of party affiliation, and we need more of this. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to be standing here today to celebrate President Ronald Wilson Reagan's 100th birthday. I yield back my time.
Now it's my distinct honor and pleasure to recognize a page. No, you're not a page. The gentleman from Illinois, and Aaron, I don't know whether you were even born when Ronald Reagan was first elected, were you?
Mr. Gallegly, I was not.
But you knew who Ronald Reagan was, and I've heard you speak about him. It's an honor to have you. And the gentleman from Illinois, Aaron Schott.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My friend from California, Mr. Gallegly, I appreciate the deference. No, I was not born when Ronald Reagan became president, but what a tribute to President Ronald Reagan this is. Rarely in Congress do we run out of time when we're talking about an issue, but Democrat-Republican time has expired. I had prepared all kinds of flowery remarks that I was going to make in tribute to the president who hails from my home state of Illinois, that I represent Eureka College, his alma mater. But I can't think of anything more to say other than the fact that so much has been said that we've run out of time, and I can't think of a greater tribute. It's why East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, Republican, Democrat, the oldest member, the youngest member, has taken time to come to the floor today, and I thank you, Mr. Gallegly from California, for organizing this hour.
And I'd just also like to recognize your tribute to Ronald Reagan the other night at the Reagan Library. It was very inspiring, and it was an honor to have you there, and thanks for being there.
I like California weather. I yield back.
Austin Scott from Georgia. Keep it real short for me, Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And ladies and gentlemen of the House, I just want to say this about President Reagan. He understood that it is the American, not the government, that make America the greatest nation on earth. It's time for this body to tackle some tough issues and follow through on tough decisions. And if I can just read his words, the Gipper's own words, let us be sure that those who come after will say of us in our time, that in our time we did everything that could be done. We finished the race, we kept them free, we kept the faith. Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remaining time.
Thank you. Next, we have my good friend from the state of Virginia and seat partner for the last 20 years on Judiciary, Bob Goodlatte.
Well, I thank the gentleman from California for yielding, and I also want to tell him how much I enjoyed visiting his congressional district less than 2 weeks ago and visiting the Reagan Presidential Library, which is a fabulous recounting of the life of the man who I think was the greatest president of the 20th century. He led America to win the Cold War. He reinstilled the economic greatness of this country from the malaise of the 1970s. And most importantly, he instilled in us his eternal optimism in America. In his farewell address, Reagan described how he envisioned the shining city he had invoked countless times. He observed of his time in office, we weren't just marking time, we made a difference, we made the city stronger, we made the city freer, and we left her in good hands. All in all, not bad at all. Not bad reflects the modesty of the man, but not the magnitude of his accomplishments. I yield back.